Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be talking about the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. So the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction is a wonderful prize that I have been following along with for quite a few years. I think this will be the 5th time that I have read along with the Walter Scott Prize. So the long list is going to be announced on the 22nd of February, and I thought that I would do some predictions this year, which I don't usually do, before the long list comes out. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about why I like the Walter Scott Prize in general, and then give you a few predictions for the long list. And then depending on how long that takes me, this might either be a separate video or I will film my reaction to the long list when it's announced in a couple of weeks' time and make that the second half of this video, skipped forward later in time. We'll just see how we go. So first off, let me explain what the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction is. As I said, it is a prize for historical fiction, and to be eligible for the Walter Scott Prize, a book has to have been first published in English like last year, depending on when the prize is. So this year, books published in 2023, and the majority of the novel needs to have been set 60 years in the past, and the book needs to have been written by an author who is from the UK, Ireland, or a Commonwealth country. And I've been reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction for quite a few years, as I said. So I first read along with the prize in 2019. I didn't end up reading along with the prize in 2020 because, you know, COVID lockdown stuff, it was very hard to get hold of the books. But then I started reading along with it again in 2021 and haven't stopped since. So this will be the 5th year that I've read along. And usually what I do is read some books from the long list when the long list is announced, and then read the entire shortlist. So I do usually read all the books on the shortlist, but I don't end up usually reading the whole long list. I would say usually I probably end up reading 9 or 10 books out of the long list, which is usually of 12 or 13 books. Sometimes I skip books by authors who I know I don't really get on with, or sometimes I skip books if they're part of series, because sometimes the Walter Scott Prize will long list a book that is like the 10th in a series, which is completely fair enough, but I'm probably not gonna read all 9 books to read that 10th book or read the 10th book, so, you know. Anyway, there are lots of reasons why I love the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. One reason is, of course, that it celebrates historical fiction, and I love historical fiction. I have been reading historical fiction for a long time. It's my favourite thing to read, maybe except for old books that are actually from the past rather than just about the past, but I love historical fiction, and I also write historical fiction myself. It's something that I'm really, really passionate about as a genre, I suppose. So I love that the Walter Scott Prize celebrates historical fiction. I also love that it really stretches my boundaries in terms of historical fiction, because I love historical fiction a lot and I read a lot of it, but I mostly read reading group historical fiction set between the 18th and the 20th centuries. I would say that my reading within historical fiction is sort of relatively narrow to a particular time period. I probably also mostly read historical fiction set in the UK. So I really like that the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction celebrates lots of different kinds of historical fiction and always encourages me to pick up historical fiction that I might not have otherwise read. The Walter Scott Prize is really good for having a range from like reading group historical fiction on the slightly more commercial end up to like really experimental literary historical fiction, which I wouldn't necessarily usually pick up. There's also usually quite a lot of books on the long list that I haven't heard of, either books that are from small independent publishers or books that have first been published in a country that isn't the UK. So for example, I often find a lot of really fantastic Australian books through the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. And the long list also tends to be quite varied in terms of like the countries and time periods that the books are set in, which I really enjoy as well. I feel like the Walter Scott Prize is also really great for having like books that engage with history in really interesting and different ways. I don't really know quite how to explain that, but I just feel like I've read some books from the long list of the Walter Scott Prize that like interact with history and what it means to study history or to think about history or to have a history like in a really, really interesting way. And I have found so many wonderful, fantastic new favourites through the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. You know, just a few would include News of the Dead by James Robertson, The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams, Now We Should Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller, The Chosen by Elizabeth Lowry, and so many more. I love the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction a lot. So let me move on to my predictions. The Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list is very hard to predict for a lot of the reasons I have just mentioned. Like I said, it often includes a lot of books I've never heard of from smaller publishers, or, you know, books that have first been published outside of the UK. But having said that, I did read quite a lot of historical fiction in 2023 that came out in 2023. So I thought I would mention a few books that I think have a chance of making the long list, some of which I have read and then some of which I haven't read, and we'll see whether or not I'm right about any of them. I have a list of 11 books, and I think I'll probably maybe get 2 maximum, but you know, let's see how we go. So I'm going to start off with 3 books that I have read and I think are pretty good bets for the Walter Scott Prize long list for historical fiction. So here we have For Thy Great Pain Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie. This is a wonderful, short, very literary historical novel which is set in the 15th century and is about Marjorie Kempt and Julian of Norwich. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a good book, and I also feel like it is very much a Walter Scott Prize book. I just feel like it is a Walter Scott Prize book. So I feel like there's a pretty decent chance that this will be on the long list, but you know, we'll see. Another book that might make the long list is The New Life by Tom Crew. This is a wonderful novel which looks at 2 men writing a book on homosexuality in the late Victorian period. I thought this was fantastic. It's been fairly critically acclaimed and praised, so maybe, but you know, who can tell? The Walter Scott Prize, as I said, is very unpredictable, which is one of the reasons why I love it. And then I also feel like Rose and the Burma Sky by Rosanna Amaka is the kind of book that might make it onto the Walter Scott Prize long list. This is a brilliant book which follows a Nigerian soldier fighting in the Second World War and his relationship with a woman called Rose. It's a really fantastic book and I would love to see this on the Walter Scott Prize long list. So those are 3 books that I've read and loved that I feel would be like pretty good bets for the Walter Scott Prize long list. And then next I have 3 books that I have read and loved but I feel like are less strong bets potentially for the Walter Scott Prize long list, partly because the 3 books I've spoken about are like a bit more on the literary historical fiction end and the next 3 are a bit more in the kind of reading group end. And the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction do usually have a few like reading group titles, but I feel like half the list probably tends to skew a bit more literary. So one book I would love to see on the long list is The Illusions by Liz Hyder. This is a wonderful book set in late Victorian Bristol, looking at magic shows and early photography. It's just fantastic and rich and wonderful. I love Liz Hyder. She is a fantastic writer. And then I would also love to see on the long list The Maiden by Kate Foster. This was another fantastic book that came out in 2023. This won the Bloody Scotland debut crime award, I think. So maybe it will be on the Walter Scott Prize long list. This book is set in 17th century Scotland and follows 2 women, one of whom is a high-class woman who has been accused of murdering her lover, and one of whom is a sex worker who is somehow involved and is going to tell her part in the story. And I thought this was fantastic. Whether or not this will make the Walter Scott Prize long list, I don't know, but I would love to see it on there. And then another book that I read in 2023 that I loved was Clytemnestra by Costanza Casati. Now this one I'm not sure about because this is a Greek myth retelling, and while it is very much not on the magical end, it's very much like embedded in the real world, and it is very much more historical fiction than anything magical or mythological. I don't think I've ever seen a Greek myth retelling on the Walter Scott Prize long list, so I don't know how likely one would be to make it onto that list, but I thought Clytemnestra was fantastic. It's a retelling of the Greek myth Clytemnestra, but as I said, very much embedded in reality, and the characterization is amazing. So those are 6 works of historical fiction that came out in 2023, that I read in 2023, that I think have some chance or another of ending up on the Walter Scott Prize long list. And then there are 5 other books that I haven't read that I think have a pretty good chance of ending up on the Walter Scott Prize long list, 2 of which I do own. So here is Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue. I love Emma Donoghue a lot. She is a fantastic, fantastic writer of historical fiction, and Learned by Heart is her new novel. And this book looks at the relationship between 2 real-life historical figures, Anne Lister and Eliza Raine, when they met at boarding school. And I feel like this book, one, will be fantastic because it's Emma Donoghue, but also I find Anne Lister really interesting. I've read her diaries, and she's a really, really interesting historical figure. So I feel like this book, one, will be great, but also the way that this book interprets Anne Lister as a historical figure could be really interesting, and that's the kind of thing the Walter Scott Prize likes, so maybe this will be on the list. I'd really like it to be on the list because it'd be a good excuse to read it soon, but who knows. And then I also have here The Bookbinder of Jericho by Pip Williams. The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams was on the Walter Scott Prize long list and shortlist, I think, a few years ago. So, you know, the Walter Scott Prize longlisted the first Pip Williams book, so maybe they'll longlist her second book too. I've heard really great things about this. And this book is, I think, about 2 female bookbinders and their experiences in the First World War, and that sounds great to me. Then there are 3 books which I don't own, haven't read, but I feel like are really good bets for the Walter Scott Prize long list. I'm kind of expecting these 3 more than the others, maybe, to be on the long list, but we'll see. And you know, if they're on the long list, then I'll read them and I'm interested. So one is The Fraud by Zadie Smith. I think this is Zadie Smith's first historical novel, but obviously she is a very well regarded, highly acclaimed author. And The Fraud is set in Victorian Britain, and it explores a real life case where someone claimed to be an heir to a baronetcy. I think this sounds really interesting and I am really keen to read it. I've read 2 books by Zadie Smith before, White Teeth and On Beauty, both of which I found quite interesting, but I did find kind of a bit too literary for my reading taste, really. But I would be interested to read The Fraud because it's historical fiction, and the premise sounds very interesting to me. And I feel like Zadie Smith being Zadie Smith, there is a pretty good chance that this might end up on the list. Although, as I said, the Walter Scott Prize is often quite left of field, which I love about it, so who could say? And then another book I think might end up on the long list is The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore. So I read A.K. Blakemore's first novel, The Manning Tree Witches, which was really, really popular and I really enjoyed too. And this is Blakemore's second novel. I feel like I haven't heard very many people review it, but I do see it everywhere in all the bookshops all of the time. And it is set, I think, in 18th century France and is about a man who can apparently eat anything and does eat anything and everything. I feel like it could be really interesting, and like I say, it's just one of those books I see in bookshops a lot and seems like a real like Waterstones and independent bookshop favourite in the UK, so maybe it will end up on the long list, we'll see. And then the final book that I think is a pretty good bet for the Walter Scott Prize long list is Cuddy by Ben Myers. So this book is a kind of experimental literary historical fiction novel, which spans from the Anglo-Saxon period, I think, to the present day, kind of inspired by and following St Cuthbert, who was an Anglo-Saxon monk and bishop, and kind of looking at him as a figure, I suppose. And I feel like this could be really interesting. I gather it's quite experimental, which sometimes I really don't get on with, but I feel like for this kind of book, maybe I would. I just have a feeling that maybe it's the kind of book I would like. And I just feel like their premise of like exploring St Cuthbert and his legacy throughout history, that just sounds very Walter Scott Prize. Saying that, I don't know how much of it does take place in the modern day, so it might be that it doesn't qualify for the majority taking place 60 years in the past bit. I think it sounds really interesting, and if it qualifies, then I'm hoping to see it on the long list. So those are 11 books that could make the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction. We will see. I feel like I've spoken about these books for long enough that this could be its own video, so if it is, then thank you very much for watching. Do leave your thoughts down in the comments, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.